My name is Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I'd like to welcome you to ALDF's 2025 Animal Law Symposium. We have an excellent array of speakers and attorneys who will be spending the next 2 days discussing the multitude of challenges, perhaps even a few opportunities posed by the new executive administration now that we're 100 days in. The topics we'll cover include significant changes at the Food and Drug Administration, recent evolutions in legal standing, issues related to the First Amendment, and finally, future challenges to animals and the environment. Our first panel will be moderated by ALDF Litigation Manager Amanda Howell, so I'll pass it over to her now. Please enjoy the symposium and make sure to submit any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Before we get truly started, just a few housekeeping items. All sessions feature closed captioned subtitles. To enable this feature, click the upward arrow near the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. Please enter any questions you have into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. The symposium is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you later via email. Without further ado, introducing FDA and Flux, regulatory approaches to cell-based meat, antimicrobial drug use in farm animals, and avian flu outbreaks. With us today is Dr. Crystal Heath, Stephen Roach, and Dr. Eric Schultz. Dr. Crystal Heath holds a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. She has spent her career helping homeless animals in shelters while also working part-time at a general practice. She's a co-founder of Our Honor, an organization committed to supporting animal professionals who want to speak their conscience, and is on the founding committee of Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown. She is also on the board of LEAP, Leaders for Ethics, Animals, and the Planet, known as the Humane Alternative to 4-H and FFA. She owns Vet Harmony, a veterinary practice committed to providing access to care and public education. Stephen Roach is the Safe and Healthy Food Program Director at Food Animal Concerns Trust, also known as FACT. In addition to his work at FACT, Steve is a senior analyst for Keep Antibiotics Working, a coalition of advocacy organizations that have joined forces to combat the inappropriate use of antibiotics in food animals. He represented Consumers International in the Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs in Food, and at the Codex Ad Hoc Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance, and has served on a World Health Organization advisory group. Steve is a citizen of the Shawnee tribe and is a community language preservationist. Steve has a master's degree in anthropology. Eric Schultz is a professional molecular biologist, genetic engineer, and former federal biotechnology regulator. He is currently founder and CEO of Good Humans Strategy and Design Agency. Dr. Schultz has served as Vice President of Global Regulatory and Public Policy at Upside Foods, leading the company's regulatory, policy, and government affairs. Before entering the private sector, he served as a regulator with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, handling a portfolio of novel food and drug biotechnology products. He holds an interdisciplinary doctorate in genetics, cellular, and molecular biology, with a specialty in embryonic stem cell engineering from the University of Southern California and a BS in biological sciences from the Loyola University, New Orleans. Very impressive resumes, hoping this panel will give us the opportunity to address the biggest public health concerns of the moment, the regulation of new food tech and risks to our public health, given the changes with regard to agency power, mandates, and priorities, and the attendant risks to animal welfare, thanks to these executive changes. With that in mind, I'd like to begin our discussion regarding the new and biggest scientific regulatory problems we're facing. So to kick it off, Dr. Heath, how will the Trump administration's recent firings and focus on deregulation affect food safety and public health?
So in early 2025, the administration had implemented these sweeping layoffs across the Department of Health and Human Services, including the USDA and the FDA. And these cuts affected key personnel and responsible for monitoring and responding to this unprecedented avian influenza outbreak that's now affected poultry and dairy herds. Notably, 140 senior veterinarians at the FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine, who were instrumental in studying the virus's transmission and ensuring the safety of dairy products, were among those dismissed. They also suspended the milk safety testing program at at the FDA. And this led to the closure of the Moffitt Center proficiency testing laboratory, which was a key facility that ensured consistent and accurate testing across the nation's food safety laboratories. So there is still the USDA testing program, under the National Milk Testing Strategy, that is trying to surveil and detect H5N1 in milk. But this is very concerning. There's also been this deregulation of poultry standards. They rolled back plans to limit salmonella levels in raw chicken and turkey. They also did away with some of the slaughter line speed limitations. So pig slaughter lines are already allowed to process as many as 1,106 hogs per hour, or roughly one pig every 3.2 seconds. But under the new policy, the USDA will remove those maximum line speed limits and allow facilities to operate at speeds they deem appropriate, provided that they maintain food safety standards. And in poultry operations, they used to allow slaughter of up to 140 birds per minute. The new limit is 175 birds per minute, so an additional 35 birds per minute. And we've already seen this very fragmented response to the avian influenza outbreak. A new $1 billion plan was announced to combat the outbreak, but we've also seen mass firings and rehirings and cancellations of webinars that would release new information. But all along, these corporate interests are protected. Indemnity payments to producers, egg layers who have avian influenza outbreaks, they are compensated for the loss of their birds who they have to kill. And the Trump administration raised those indemnity payments from $7 a bird up to $17 per egg laying hen. So there's really less incentive for these corporations to transition to less risky methods of food production. So this is all sort of very concerning. This combination of workforce reductions, deregulation, fragmented strategies has really affected our food safety, our public health, and potentially could lead to more severe outbreaks of diseases like avian influenza.
If I could jump in, because I agree. As a former regulator, this is horrible. As a industry executive, this sucks. As a consumer, it's terrible. So, as someone who worked with Trump 1's USDA and FDA, there was a lot more reasonable compromise that was implemented. Not that it was all daisies and roses, but this go around has been a 180, as Dr. Heath mentions. The rifts, as a former federal employee, I've got more texts in the last 3 months asking for jobs, begging for what's happening, and freakouts from company executives in the food sector. I mean, I don't think it's hyperbole to say there's minor chaos amongst sort of what has been expected. And I'll say this last from a policy perspective. What I'm observing is a general attitude of deregulation, which is typical in conservative administrations. But that is at odds with the command and control style that has been implemented, which means they need rules and different ways and norms of doing things, which requires more interventions policy-wise. So that's at odds with a deregulatory environment. So the thing that I'm watching is how they're going to resolve this apparent necessary tension, I guess, which is how do you deregulate while still over-regulating? And then, of course, each agency has been requesting more resources and staff for the last 25 years. So I don't think this is going to end well.
Speaking to FDA's motivations, I think that there's always been a bit of suspicion regarding agency capture. Steve, I'd love to hear, how has FDA's general unwillingness to act, paired with its deference to animal agriculture, hindered its ability to fulfill its public health mission when it comes to antibiotics and other, dangerous veterinary drugs. In particular, how has this and how will this change given FDA's all this recent turmoil we're hearing about?
Yeah, so I've been working trying to get what I always describe my job as is trying to get FDA to actually fulfill its public health mission. So what I have always seen FDA up until now, and I can talk a little bit about what now is basically it has a public health mission, but it also is always getting all this pressure from outside forces to not do anything. And so what that meant is like in the 1970s, FDA identified antibiotic resistance as a problem that they hadn't addressed in earlier approvals, and they basically started hearing processes to withdraw a drug. But it took into for uses that are non-therapeutic, which would be growth promotion and also routine disease prevention. They didn't act on that until 2017 was when we finally got where you couldn't just give antibiotics to make animals grow more quickly. So that's like 40 years of inaction. Since the late 1990s, they've said we need to collect data from what on farm. They haven't done that. So what I see is there is always this tension between um, doing what the industry wants, and they have a lot of power, and supporting the animal drug industry, and then their public health mission. And I always felt my job is to make sure, at least try to push them more in the public health mission. Now, with the current administration, they seem to be more willing to break things. So maybe in some cases they aren't listening to the industry. But I kind of agree with Eric and Crystal that it's, how they're doing it is kind of uh, very bad. And we have a FDA commissioner who's on the record saying we should use less antibiotics to raise animals because it creates a public health problem. We have a HHS secretary that's been quite vocal about large scale animal ag, which we don't like. But at the same time, you get rid of the staff. And even if we were to get through these guys, because they are maybe more open to a message where they're not willing to break things, I don't know if it'll last even, because there's going to have to be a correction at some point down in the future anyway. So, but we are continuing to try to, again, I'm always trying to push the agencies to actually protect public health, because that's as I see it, that's their overriding mission. And so for us, we're pushing them, but it's also there's so many other bad things going on at the same time. I mean, and it seems like I always, I guess maybe because I engage with the agency, I think in risk. And it's like our risk, the things that are considered extremely and not risky, they're just all screwed up now by the decision making. So we're not making risk-based decisions. They're not making science-based decisions. And so maybe they don't have as much deference to the industry, but we don't know what the outcome will be. So I think there's, we were trying to think, because like with the Loper Bright decision and the agency not doing what the law says, animal drug regulation, I think they kind of don't do regulations anymore. They just do guidances, because it gets them around some of those controls. I mean, FDA deregulated animal feed by using a compliance guidance. So it's just saying we won't enforce the rules. So there may be some room again for change, but through the courts, but in this system, I think thinking about it, but it's just that with all the chaos, you don't know, which way to go. We're tending to trying to do some of the same strategies that we have in the past, but we have really not a clear idea of where we're going to go with that.
Your point about
And Steve,
oh, I'm sorry, Eric, go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to talk about regulatory capture, because I think that's a really interesting, it's a concept that's perennial. But like, and I'm sure everyone here knows, I'm not a lawyer, but like when FDA is, statutorily prohibited from effectively being for or against any technology. Steve correctly notes it's a risk-based decision. You are evaluating risk. That's all you are at FDA. That's all you can do. USDA has a statutory requirement to promote U.S. agricultural interests, which is the exact opposite. And what I found is we're seeing USDA has seen less cuts overall, I think percentage-wise, than FDA. And FDA is, again, I don't think I took one lobbying meeting when I was at FDA because we weren't allowed to. So this idea that we're sort of cutting the fat, or these, fat cats, the regulators trying to stuff their pockets, and sort of kowtowing to industry, frankly, is bullshit. And so I just being direct about it, I think it's again overblown. And as Steve correctly notes, they're just flooding the zone with lots of different things for us to pay attention to stave away actual meaningful issues, which of course we're trying to address here.
I think, Eric, that kind of dovetails nicely with a question that we got in the Q&A. How would you, Steve, Chris, Dr. Heath, respond to folks who say, well, isn't this just a cleaning house? If we're saying FDA has never been really that effective, isn't this a way of just kind of like wiping the slate clean and kind of like starting over? And then I'll also append another question that we got in the chat. Isn't this like anti-industry deference great? Isn't that good for animals? So putting that to the room.
Yeah, I mean, it's concerning, like Eric said, the USDA already had sort of this imperative to protect the interests of the industry, but there were veterinarians working there and in other places who were trying their best to test and to manage these crises, these avian influenza outbreaks, and do their work protecting the animals and public health. They were already up against, they already had the interests of the industry that they were fighting against. And now the Trump administration has made it even harder for them to do their job, reducing the workforce even more severely and protecting corporate interests even more. They famously kind of said in the beginning that the stamping out of mass depopulations hadn't worked, but we also have no reason to believe that not stamping out, not managing these depopulations will lead to any better outcomes. And I think with fewer USDA veterinarians trying to address these issues and manage this avian influenza outbreak, do the testing, respond to outbreaks, we're going to see even a greater flourishing of this virus. USDA was already short-staffed when it came to veterinarians and professionals trying to manage the billions of animals that we have to care for in our food system. And now they're up against an even greater problem with even fewer staff to deal with this and confront the industry and test and manage this outbreak. So it's a really challenging situation that's been made even worse.
And Dr. Heath is right. There's limited to no evidence that the U.S. government, in terms of its staffing, is any less efficient than other sectors or other governments in terms of rooting out underperforming staff members. Again, I suspect you're being fed a line if you believe that this is just rooting out, just cleaning house. Then the FDA employs some of the most terminally degreed people in the planet, as an example. USDA as well. PhDs, veterinarians, medical doctors. These are people that forewent much larger salaries in the private sector to go work in public service. And everyone, including myself that did it, believed in what we were doing. And so we did it with passion and dedication to the mission. And these are civil people. Civil servants don't have political alliances officially. So again, this idea that we're just trying to clean house, again, you're being fed a line. And so I just want to emphasize that we need more people, not less right now. Dr. Heath is correct.
Yeah, and even before we had the firings, we didn't have it. There wasn't enough staff at USDA. So on the USDA side, the program that's supposed to take care of animal diseases and also avoid introduction of animal diseases into the U.S. is APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And they have struggled for years to address importation of diseases, and it's already had catastrophic impacts. So if you look, the orange industry in Florida has been destroyed by an introduced disease. And it ties back to the antibiotics, which now then the EPA allowed them an emergency operation to basically treat all of the citrus trees in Florida with an antibiotic. So, so these things tie together, and we saw the same thing over in the about 10 years ago, there was an introduced disease into the pig industry. It wasn't something that impacted humans, but porcine epidemic diarrhea. It actually reduced production of swine in the US and pigs. And these things are all tied together because then they treat more antibiotics with these sick pigs. So you start having pigs sick, so the amount of antibiotics. And as I said, APHIS, we have been advocating for years for giving APHIS a bigger budget for addressing both introduced disease and also controlling the ones that can jump to humans, like avian flu. And it was already like really small. I mean, it was tiny. And now we've fired people and talking about further cuts. And I think some of the research arms at USDA are also are being drastically cut because I would say, like Dr. Schultz said, they actually do very good jobs, and sometimes they don't agree with the ideological messages at the end that Trump administrators wanted. So the Economic Research Service was doing a really great job. And the first Trump administration really damaged them by moving them to Kansas. So we're kind of in a scary place. And I guess I wanted to go back to, again, something that Dr. Heath said about, reducing that salmonella standard, which we haven't done a great job of controlling salmonella. It's a foodborne disease, a major foodborne disease in the US. Again, that comes back to my issue is there's two ways you can get rid of the resistant infections in people that come from food. And one is, to reduce the amount of antibiotics so each infection is less likely to be resistant. The other one is to have less salmonella. And we're actually going with this one. I fear we're going in the direction of more salmonella. And then you tie it in if we have more disease, because we're not having APHIS do a good job of controlling diseases, then it comes up. And, I think, I don't know how the trade issues are going to work around. There's a whole bunch of things that how trade will impact health, and what how the whole system is going to work is very it's uncertain. Like I said, on everything, I feel like we're in kind of this time where we don't know what's going to happen.
I agree with that uncertainty. I also think that kind of as a backdrop, something that we've kind of been dancing around is this tension between like this increasing reliance on science, modern biotechnology, in order to meet food needs in this country and globally. But there's also, at least in this country, maybe an increase in the lack of trust in science and expertise overall. So, Eric, if you want to kick us off, like is it your position that we have some headwinds politically and regulatorily, and like what do we do now? And are these things true?
Yeah, I'm curious what my other panelists have to say on this too. I mean, as a scientist and a genetic engineer and a molecular biologist, like obviously I have a certain perspective on this, and I believe, one, again, as a former regulator, today is the safest food. Well, we actually could debate that, but in the macro trend, today is the safest food we've ever had in the history of humanity. I doubt that people woke up today wondering if their food was going to make them sick, although that may change in the future if things continue. But I think in general, science, and that is because of science and medicine and veterinary sciences. The gap between people that know how to do this and the people that use those technologies also, again, like most people don't know how their smartphones work, but they just want them to work. We don't have that same attitude with our food, unfortunately. There's a lot, I think, because food is so much more easy to understand. People feel like they can opine on it, which I totally understand. However, we are going to become and are increasingly reliant on science and modern science and biotechnology to feed a growing population. The world's population will hit probably plateau in the next 30 years to about 10 billion. And we've got to feed a lot of mouths to get there. That's not going to happen using organic farming. It's going to require modern science to do so, to eat healthy. So I think part of the issue here is macro trend, we're seeing broader acceptance, I think, of science and food, but we're seeing a local repudiation of anything that's seen as rebranded as toxic or poison, which is as a placeholder for science in your food, which is, I think, mistaken. Food is safer because of science. Science makes the safest food we've ever had. But I'm curious what my panelists think.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say our food is safe, but the food production methods that we have to produce food right now is inherently not safe and getting riskier because we're dependent on large-scale, modern, intensive animal agriculture, which creates this infectious disease trap where we have the more we confine animals intensively, we're creating conditions where they're highly stressed, genetically similar animals in close proximity to human beings, where we can create viruses of pandemic potential, influenza spillovers into human beings. But also at the same time, if leading to more deforestation, where we are now deforesting more land to grow crops to feed those animals, also creating an interface with wild animal populations that also creates potential disease spillover events. But even if we want to stop deforestation, that leads to greater intensification, which can lead to more virus spillover because of that more intensive confinement of animals to conserve land and resources. So this is the infectious disease trap of animal agriculture. So the production methods are inherently risky. So that means that we should, transition more to animal-free methods of food production. But of course, the industry wants to decrease consumer trust in animal-free methods of protein production, making those seem very unsafe. And as we've seen with the new FDA guidance that's come out, they want to sort of obfuscate the language around animal-free protein and require these extra labeling to kind of confuse consumers, because if we were to decrease the number of slaughter-bound animals, that would hurt not only feed industry profits, but pharmaceutical company profits who profit from the sale of pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, vaccines to animals. So I think that's a problem that we need to address and amplify.
Yeah, I guess I could go back to the question on science. I agree we should have science-based decision making, but I have a friend who's always like, the science shows that, therefore FDA will have to do this. And that has not been actually my experience on the way, because these are policy decisions. So what is it if you make this change in your so if we withdraw these drugs, or if we take I think some of the easier ones are, one of the drugs we've worked at for years is looking at carbadox, which was a known carcinogen. FDA knew it was a carcinogen when they approved it. It still has, and since 2003, they had evidence that the data that they used to approve it, in terms of how long the carbadox residues lasted in the food, since 2003, they know that data was wrong. But they still, up until this day, they started in 2016 trying to withdraw the drug, and it's still on the market, and it generally takes them decades. So there's a lot of policy science decisions. The pork industry swears up and down that the drug's safe. The FDA actually believes it's unsafe, but they're struggling to get rid of it. So I think science isn't always, it has to be science within a policy framework that we can only get things done. I would say in terms of feeding the world, I mean, I think, I think we don't really have a challenge to do that. It's just how we use our resources that we have. I mean, right now, 20%, half of the corn land in Iowa is going to raise ethanol to burn in our cars. We don't need to do that. We have land. But I do think it does require us to, our organization always talks about producing less animals. I mean, because it's a lot less efficient to raise proteins and then feed it to an animal. And how do we change that? And I would say my approach to that is stop subsidizing the feed that goes into animals so much. I mean, people tend to think the amount of meat that Americans eat is some type of natural thing out of their internal desire to consume more meat. A lot of it is driven by policies behind it, subsidies to that sector, and large subsidies to the feed that, we don't generally eat corn and soybean in any amounts compared to how much we produce in the US. And so that's a huge subsidy to the meat industry because it's their major input. And that's going to have to change. And I think one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of climate change and also with things like, these disease risks that are just keep coming, how do we change our food system to make it a healthier food system? Right now, most of or a large part of the cattle are fed down in the lower Great Plains, and there's not a lot of water down there. It's not a very smart place to raise ruminants that actually eat grass. And you have horror stories about taking huge quantities amount of the water from the Colorado River that's just going to raise feed for animals or to ship it to Saudi Arabia so they can raise animals in Saudi Arabia. It's just we have a really policy structure in the US that is destructive and it's harmful, and it has all of these negative impacts on many things.
So we're talking a lot and referencing policies quite a bit. So make America healthy again. Like what are the changes? What are their policies? And are those policies supported by the public? Is there any common ground between parties and the interest groups? I don't know, Eric, do you want to tackle that first and then we can kind of pass it around?
Sure. I like to invoke Nobel laureate physicist Richard Feynman, who's in reference to this, but he would say, anyone who claims to understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand quantum mechanics. I think that's the same about Maha's policies. There are a lot of, I think, very good intentions in terms of like the dietary shifts in nutrition that RFK and his cohort are saying that they want to work on. And I think a lot of bipartisan support. But I also think that the policy specifics are obfuscated or non-existent. I don't see that there's a coordinated strategy beyond even sort of the rifts at the agencies. But I do think that from the people I've spoken with and that are ex-regulators and scientists or whatever, do agree with the Maha movement around things like trying to find ways to improve the diets and improve the nutrition of the foods that we consume, improve the ways that we get those foods, like Steve was mentioning, around how, the efficiency in our production system, and as Crystal was mentioning, too, de-intensification as well. But beyond that, I personally have not found a particular policy agenda, but again, I could be just missing it in the ether somewhere.
I'll take Dr. Heath and Steve's silence's agreement with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because like there are a lot of people recommending a lot of things and publishing a lot of papers on what they recommend. Will that be implemented by the administration when they seem to only care about corporate interests? But some of the things that many people are recommending, and I would recommend, is testing for zoonotic pathogens like H5N1. It should be required with transparent reporting, not left to private discretion. This includes at cattle, poultry, and swine operations, and testing meat, milk, manure, wastewater, because early detection is absolutely critical. We need to phase out these high-risk animal-based protein production practices, and we should be incentivizing that instead of raising indemnity payments from $7 an egg-laying hen to $17 an egg-laying hen. We should be supporting those corporations that are producing protein using animal-free methods and providing access to animal-free meals, and incentivizing corporations like McDonald's to put those things on their menus, because this is absolutely necessary for our nation's food security. We need mandatory biosecurity education to workers and public health and the public needs education about biosecurity. I mean, I was recently in New York at the live poultry markets there, and there's no signage anywhere warning people of the risk of entering these facilities while there have been 22 outbreaks in Queens, New York, of these live poultry markets. And public health officials were advising these companies to put signage out to not let customers come into their workplaces. They were advising the workers to wear masks and gloves, but we saw none of that when we explored these live poultry markets. So it's not mandatory, it's just advised, and we need to make it mandatory and enforce it. And we need One Health legislation that links human, animal, and environmental health. So we need a more integrated public health infrastructure that links the USDA, FDA, and CDC to manage these zoonotic threats holistically together rather than in isolated silos. But without these structural changes with how we farm animals and how we incentivize corporations, we are only buying time until the next zoonotic pandemic emerges.
Yeah, that actually was going to be one of my next questions to everyone, kind of with public health. And we've been talking about these buckets with like antibiotic resistant diseases, food safety, like is the food that we're actually eating safe, and also zoonotic diseases, like Dr. Heath was just talking about. So I guess my question to the group is, what happens in really concrete terms if current trends continue, if we don't address these issues and make changes that everyone seems to be recommending?
Yeah, I guess I could jump in a little bit. And I think, again, Dr. Heath, I want to, highlight that whole question about surveillance, because we aren't even looking for avian influenza in beef cattle. And there's no reason to believe that somehow dairy cattle are more susceptible to avian influenza than beef
100%.
cattle.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you've ever been to a feedlot, what's in there eating the feed along with the cattle? There's birds. I mean, so, and we aren't even doing that. And the pigs, I agree. I think what we need there is what we need in a system is some type of uniform surveillance. And maybe it doesn't have to hit every producer in the country, but if you were to cover like a couple thousand of the largest feedlots, you'd still be getting 90% of the cattle produced in the US, because there's such huge concentration. And yeah, I think one of the things we're talking about as we keep going, I mean, is the end goal that we'll have like 10 feedlots that produce all the cattle in the US, 100 poultry farms, because that's where the trends are. And then you have that huge concentration of animals. And that, we've seen is with the more animals you have together, the more antibiotics you're using, because there's a lot more disease pressure, and it's just not a healthy system to raise animals. I'm probably less, I think our food is generally safe, but there's an awful lot of people that get salmonella infections, Campylobacter infections in the US. There's fewer E. coli, toxigenic E. coli infections, but those are pretty bad. So, and so I think I don't think we're where we need to be. I mean, there's been public health goals related to salmonella and Campylobacter for years, and we aren't actually approaching where we'd like to be on those. So we could do better. And if we're doing worse, in terms of antibiotics and more concentration of animals, I suspect we're also putting ourselves at risk, and we already see it with the bird flu, where you have egg prices going up because you have, again, once it gets into one of those very large facilities where they have millions of laying hens, that takes out a significant portion of the egg producers in the U.S., the laying hens in the U.S. And we saw that in COVID too. Our system is very it's not very flexible, and it's really vulnerable to shocks. And I think that's where we're going. I don't know on the antibiotic resistance. I think the problem with antibiotic resistance is we do make new drugs, so we kind of we have some safety, but it's kind of like the water's rising. The rate that resistance is going up is higher. but you don't really know that you have this really big problem until all the drugs are gone. And then you're like, oops, because we keep going to the next drug, over my father's lifetime. Actually, my father was born before most of the antibiotics were approved or actually invented and created. But in over his lifetime, penicillin, tetracyclines, there's a lot of infections we don't consider those drugs anymore, which were the mainstay when I was a kid. So, and I just think we're gonna, I always don't, it's like two different things going on at the same time: antibiotic resistance and bird flu. Bird flu may just, if it starts transferring between people, we got another COVID. But there's also other, there's other COVID viruses out there in the pigs right now. Are we paying attention to those? I mean, there could be multiple things happening at once. And
I'll add. Oh, please. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, go ahead. I think that's enough for me.
Oh no, I was gonna aggressively agree with you in that I also believe there's also like solutions that are unexplored, because I agree with both of you that like the next xeno infection will likely happen. Is using genetic immunity. I mean, we have scientific tools that allow us to create new ways of resisting some of these potential pathogens that we don't use or explore because there's not commercial incentive / consumer acceptance for genetically engineered animals. Um, Steve, also, you brought up a very germane point, which is policy. And I always see policy is where the law and science, which are two immiscible liquids, force each other into emulsification. They just have to come together. And that little tiny overlap is policy. Um, and I think there hasn't been willpower around that. So one, there's a solution. We just don't explore it. And we've been doing it in pigs for a while. And it's taken a while, but it seems to work. Um, and then, of course, the other, again, is you're right, is this idea of de-intensification practices as well to reduce the risk. And then, as Crystal mentioned as well, more consumer education around some of these risks that are, and frankly, will eventually be built into the price of these products as we continue to see these issues.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, this costs us a lot of money. Just the cost of salmonella infections from pork consumption costs us $1.9 billion a year annually. 10% of the salmonella in the US were multi-drug resistant. And 60% of mother pigs in gestation crates tested positive for salmonella. So like intensive confinement does lead to greater antibiotic resistance with these pathogens that cost us a lot of money. And 27.1% of medically important antibiotics sold in the US were for pork production, according to a 2018 report. And with these avian influenza viruses, people who get viruses are often co-infected with bacteria as well. And they can often be co-infected with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So it's a concerning situation that's developing.
One factor that we haven't yet talked about, but that's been hovering for me, is alternative proteins. Because I think they don't suffer from a lot of these issues that we've been discussing, but it seems that the regulatory system has maybe been stress tested to some extent regarding alternative proteins. We're talking both cultivated and plant-based. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what y'all think about the outcomes of that system currently, and where things are going to be headed, and including why so much perceived kind of adversarial positions from the current administration and industry regarding alternative proteins.
I'm happy to kick it off since I've worked in this industry now for 10 years and helped start it. It's specifically cultivated meat. So I designed and brought the first cultivated meat product to the market in the US, as well as a policy. I designed the food itself, the literal actual food, and then the policy to go along with it. And I'll tell you, it is because primarily the challenge is that it's viewed as a novel food ingredient. We don't have a novel food system here in the United States, but it is viewed as such. So it's evaluated as if it had never been consumed before, even though it is basically the same meat that you've been consuming, just produced a new way. And you're right, it does solve for a lot of the issues. It doesn't use any antibiotics. It's much more energy efficient than feeding an animal. It doesn't have an immune system. You don't have to grow an animal. It doesn't get sick. You just have to grow the muscle tissue, the fat tissue, the connective tissue. So without belaboring that, the thing that ties it all together with like plant-based and mycoproteins and what all these other alternatives is, one, the key factors, this isn't magic and market forces, it is availability and cost. And as good as we're doing, people and everyone on this panel knows this, the scale of food production is so unimaginably large that it is hard to fathom that 1,000,000 pounds of meat processed a week is considered a small to mid-size meat processing operation. Like, that is an insane amount of production. And then you're working on commodity and margin pricing for these products and your inputs. It is very hard to produce the amount of food that you need to produce in order to meet scale and availability. And then on top of it, just to put this in perspective, I did a modeling exercise that said, like, if we are going to give everyone in San Francisco one cultivated burger a week, in order to produce that, I would go through the entire world's supply of amino acids in 3 months. And those amino acids are used to make drugs and every other fermentation product on the planet. So like, the scale is just immeasurably. So we need time to figure out scale, and investors don't want to wait. They want 5 years return on investment, and the federal government hasn't formally supported these measures in any meaningful capacity like they have subsidizing the traditional agricultural industry. So those are a couple of things that again point to what could work and why they're not working as well as they could. But I do believe they are the path forward, and the technologies we've not yet come through that invented. But I'm curious what my panelists think as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, like, the animal-based protein industry has had literally hundreds of years and invested trillions and trillions of dollars to increase their production efficiency over the years. And we're just getting started with animal-free methods of protein production. Of course, there's beans and, things we already produce, but 1/3 of our arable land is going to produce food to feed animals in animal-based protein production. But there's so many externalities associated with that, with animal-based methods of protein production. And one paper says that if we were to transition to animal-free methods of protein production, that would save us $7.3 trillion in global ecosystem degradation and other externalities, public health threats. So it is vital, and we're not going to be able to feed 10 billion people using the current methods of protein production that we have. So it's imperative. And I hope we can also get the animal protein industry executives on board with this, because we're running out of land to feed these animals. We're running out of water. So it's necessary, but unfortunately, corporations usually only consider short-term effects, and it's already an entrenched system, and so there's a huge challenge, and we need sort of a space program like enthusiasm around supporting animal-free methods of protein production.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'm a big bean fan myself, so personally, I don't actually understand the appeal to the alternatives to it. So, but then I do eat a little bit of meat if I know how it's raised, so I'm kind of different on that case. But I think the bigger point is how do we quit? The first step before spending a whole bunch of money on these new proteins is, how about quit spending so much money on the traditional confinement agriculture? I mean, that it's kind of like, for me, there's like very simple steps that we haven't started taking yet, and it's like, stop subsidizing that, and then at least see what type of choices people make. But Eric, so you, or Dr. Schultz, you mentioned that you don't use antibiotics. I thought in some of the meat culture that they actually do use antibiotics to make sure you don't have overrun with bacteria. So I'm just curious, is that correct?
You use antibiotics for the initial biopsy because you're coming from a farm animal, but then you never use it after that. So yeah, in the grand scheme of things, they're used, I think, initially and then never used again. But at scale, they're not used at all. In fact, it's counterproductive to use antibiotics because it hides latent infections. You can do it without antibiotics fully too, but you're again pulling cells out of a farm animal is risking bringing in pathogens into the lab.
So before this panel, we solicited questions from everyone here. And I think one common thread that each of you were interested in talking about that I think everyone who's listening is also interested in is what policy changes would you recommend? What if you had your druthers, if you were in charge and could just, magic wand everything? What in terms of the regulations, in terms of, what you would have agencies do, what policies and regulatory behavior would you say would fix the food system, as it were?
You want me to go first? Well, I would, of course, I recommend not subsidizing animal-based protein production and incentivizing, redirecting public funds towards animal-free methods of protein production. But in the meantime, we also need to mandate biosecurity, mandate PPE in live poultry markets, in modern intensive animal-based protein production facilities. Our on-the-ground investigation showed depopulation cleanups happening and workers not wearing masks and PPE when H5N1 stays on surfaces for 120 days. And this poses a severe public health risk. And we saw workers not wearing PPE in these live poultry markets as well. And we also need to mandate testing at the farm level and more intensive testing of animals for a variety of diseases. I would de-emphasize laboratory vivarium-based testing and do more testing at the production facility level. In New York, they were saying that they tested 30 birds at the source poultry facility before those birds were transported into the Queens live poultry markets. But we saw outbreaks in the Queens live poultry markets, and yet no outbreaks at the source facilities. And I think a lot of producers right now have H5N1 infected poultry flocks and are just sending them to slaughter. We also got documents of a Foster Farms slaughter truck where 20% of the birds on the slaughter truck showed signs of illness. And it wasn't until they arrived at the plant and a inspector noted the signs that it was found, and Foster Farms also was refusing to allow them to test according to our FOIA documents that they received. So this is why testing is so vital and should be mandatory, and these producers shouldn't get to say, no, we will not allow you to test our birds. That's while animal protein production exists, we need to implement more testing and more biosecurity for sure.
Yeah,
I'm happy to add. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I focus a lot on antibiotics, so it's kind of a small picture. I agree with Dr. Heath. I think the surveillance, we really do need mandatory active surveillance. We have wastewater surveillance in humans. We need a similar system wherever you have concentrated animal feeding operations. And I think, yeah, I think that interest, what you're saying about Foster Farms, also, how do we get these raw cat food diets causing people to get sick or causing cats to get sick? It means that animals are going to slaughter that have bird flu, which should not be happening. I mean, that's a failure. But on the antibiotics, I mean, for my whole career, I've kind of argued the same thing. Let's stop giving antibiotics to animals that aren't sick. I mean, and actually prevent disease in animals by raising them in healthy conditions. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the ideal system that I would envision, and a lot of us envision, at least where you're raising with outdoor access, but at least keeping them healthy enough so you aren't anticipating that all of your animals are going to get sick, so you're giving all your animals routine antibiotics. So I think that's the one. In addition to looking for pathogens on farm, we should also have reporting about how much antibiotics and what other drugs are being used on farm. And on a animal drug regulation one of the issues that I've seen in this happen is that we've been doing some work on ractopamine, which is another drug that is used as a growth promoter. And the FDA identified when they approved it a lot of animal health risks. It doesn't provide any benefit, any health benefit to the animal. It just lets you raise them for a little bit cheaper. Um, and but FDA basically says increased death is not a reason to consider a drug unsafe when it comes to animal health or increased levels of lameness. So that would I would like them to have a animal safety definition that actually says if you increase the number of cancers, you increase the number of death in animals, that's considered unsafe. That would be a simple thing. And the final one is we have something called the now I'm spacing on it. But basically, when you have a carcinogenic feed additive or animal drug, you're not allowed to do it under the Delaney Clause. You shouldn't be able to approve that drug. Um, but then we have the DES proviso. So it allows you to give an animal a carcinogenic drug if then the FDA approves a method to test to make sure there's no carcinogenic residues. But by approving a method, it actually generally means that they allow you to have carcinogenic residues in your meat. Now, there's only one animal drug itself left, and that's Carbadox, that is approved under the DES proviso. But I would like to see that gone so that we don't continue to approve carcinogenic animal drugs. Because then what's happened in the past is for all the other ones, FDA has to spend 10 years in legal wrangling with the drug maker to actually get the drugs withdrawn from the market. But those are kind of little things. I mean, the bigger thing is how do we end the subsidies that make this really, really incredibly unhealthy system stop? And I think that is where I know Dr. Schultz meant not about regulatory capture, but at some on these really high policy levels, I think there is, people are really reluctant to adopt policies and challenge things that would require us to do some more major changes in the industry. I mean, I would say the FDA will do whatever it can to fight antibiotic resistance as long as nobody has to change anything they're doing right now. So, and sometimes I feel like that's where we're at.
I'll add, I again agree. I think that to your point around the folks not wanting to change, one of my number one, and again, I'm going from like structural issues at the highest levels that would affect, I think, all of us, including food and drugs, is altering the Administrative Procedures Act to be able to implement changes based off more the speed of evidence and data and information and science. It's been correctly noted throughout this entire is like it's very hard to change anything to force change to raise it's very hard to do that and then implement it in a timely fashion. That is a valid critique of the U.S. government, especially our regulatory regime, and it's not been meaningfully changed because it's in part very difficult to actually meaningfully change any aspect. And again, I think that has to change. That would be my first thing. The second would be international harmonization on food safety and rearing practices. There are many, and as Steve, has worked on these, like there's many ways to do this. It's again, very bureaucratic and hard. I think it just needs to continue happening. And then I think that, for example, codifying alternative proteins and biomanufacturing into the Farm Bill, and enacting Department of Energy policy akin to electrification, where we effectively light a fire under innovation to find new ways to feed people and not have to rely as much on existing systems. And then finally, hiring more people, doing the exact opposite of what is happening. We need more people to do this work. I would love if conventional meat products went through the safety evaluation that my cultivated meat product went through, which you can review online. It's all publicly available. I've made sure to do that. Unredacted. The cultivated meat product that went to market is arguably the most studied chicken product that's ever been consumed by a human being. compared to any other chicken product. And I wish all food products went through this level of rigor. But to do that, we'll need more people. And we need more smarter people and smart people to be hired by the US government to do that. And right now, we're doing the exact opposite of all of the things that I am mentioning.
So that actually brings me to the fact that we've discussed a lot of worrying stuff during this panel, a lot of uncertainty and identifying a lot of problems. So is there any hope? What has happened? What do you see on the horizon that gives you a little bit of balm for this heartburn, given all the changes? And being cognizant of time, I do want to leave some time for people to engage in the Q&A and answer some of those questions. But I think something else that's also on people's minds is what can they do, and what are advocates doing to address all of these issues?
Okay, good. I'll be brief. I think that the thing that innovation hasn't stopped. If anything, it's accelerated. Restrictions and constraints make people more creative. So I think that also voicing your disagreement is incredibly enlightening and supportive. And then, what can you do again, outside of just saying like, I don't agree with this and this is going to seem silly, but like start a company, build a solution. Like I can't tell you how much disproportionately positivity that adds to the discussion when you have leverage of a product or a service that you're trying to bring to consumers. I realize it's not practically feasible for everyone, but it still is a very, very good lever of power, is to start a company and be the change you want to see.
Yeah, and I will just add, our small nonprofit has had a lot of success in speaking directly to the media. Veterinarians have more public trust than nearly any profession. And unfortunately, animal advocates don't have a lot of public trust, but veterinarians do. And the press loves to talk to us. And the industry PR during infectious disease outbreaks is designed to control the facts and the framing. And they use their own trusted messengers like farmers, who have a lot of public trust, and their goal is to minimize the risk, maintain consumer confidence, and protect their profits, and lobby the government to protect their interests. But concerned individuals and nonprofits can intervene even without massive resources. And this is what you can do. Like, we just went to farms with a camera and were able to get press, Newsweek, the New York Times, Vanity Fair, 60 Minutes, and recently BBC Science Focus to publish our work and talk about these issues and speak to public health officials to confront and change the narrative. And we need to do more to leverage alternative media as well. We saw how powerful podcasts were and social media was in this past election. And we need to do the same thing and get our voices and perspectives heard using trusted messengers, and utilize those independent journalists and scientists to bypass traditional gatekeepers. I think a lot of scientists, veterinarians especially, are afraid to talk to the media because they're afraid of being misquoted, and they're afraid of the backlash from their own professions for going against corporate interests. But I think we need to empower others to speak their truth and break this code of silence that perpetuates these systems that only protect corporate interests. So that's what I would encourage people to do. Go see things for yourself, talk to groups like mine and others, and get your message heard. And let's change the industry narrative.
Yeah, I guess I could go. For me, it seems like we're at a place where we have to change. I mean, I don't think we really have a choice. I think given climate change, our food system is going to change. I think the chaos of the current administration, I think there will be a backlash to that. I mean, I think it's maybe we hope at some point that we will change, and that there's going to be some looking at new things and new ways to do things, and hopefully that would be an opportunity. to change things because right now, as I said, we, you know, from working on this stuff for, 25 years now, there's been a lot of, I feel like we're stuck often, like trying to get something through Congress has been really, at least for the last 10 years, has been very difficult because it's pretty much, you have one of the parties will very unwilling to challenge anything that industry would want, and the other one is not really willing to challenge it either, except on a very low level. So, but I'm hoping that that we are actually in a time where we can move towards change. As I said, I don't think we can continue to raise animals, particularly beef cattle, how we are. With climate change, it's just going to become more tenable. The Southern Great Plains is not a place where we can continue to do that. So as we shift, maybe there's room for change in that way. So.
I think selfishly, I also want to say that I think that the legal system and the litigation in particular is very useful for challenging, agency action that is unconstitutional or overly burdensome. I'm specifically thinking about those alternative proteins. FDA has had a guidance out there. I'd love to hear more actually on that point. Eric, you mentioned, and Steve also, you mentioned agencies using guidance documents to kind of effectuate some policy changes without having to go through formal notice and comment rulemaking and the attendant challenges. Do you have any hope for challenging guidance documents, or is that something that you think is going to grow as a agency kind of strategy?
Well, I would say on the animal side, I mean, for most of the stuff that I work with, it's all guidance documents now. I think we were looking at the USDA just did a rule on indemnification payments. And I was like, wow, USDA is actually still using rulemaking when they make decisions, because for most of the stuff on antibiotics, we aren't. But I do believe that there are grounds for making legal challenges, is that they're essentially using these guidance documents as a way to avoid the rulemaking. Because on the Center for Veterinary Medicine, where I work with all the time, they've also gotten rid of their advisory committee. So the points, with the guidance, they don't have to actually respond to your comments. So, and I don't think we've ever really challenged them on a guidance to see whether they could change it, because they always put the disclaimer that it doesn't have any impact at all in the beginning of it. So I think there may be some rooms in where I was actually more interested in thinking about legal challenges, where they make policy by doing a compliance document where they say we're not going to enforce a regulation or a law just because we don't want to do it. And I think under that there is some room as well. And that's essentially, in 2012, FDA deregulated salmonella in animal feeds using a compliance policy guidance. And it's kind of, and then then they refer to that compliance policy guidance in some of the food safety regulations under the FSMA rule in 2022, basically totally deregulating salmonella in animal feed. And before 2012, any salmonella in animal feed was an adulterant. And now pretty much none are an adulterant. So.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Guidances are going to keep being used primarily. So are CPGs. So don't see that changing. Notice and comments, quote unquote, too hard. So
Creative challenges are the way of the future. We have about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to turn to the Q&A for a little bit. I think this kind of was covered a little bit, but I think it's a lovely question, so I'm going to read it out. This is from Privali Regula. We're a youth-led student organization passionate about raising awareness on how animal rights and environmental laws are interconnected, especially the hidden consequences of industrial animal testing, like public health risks, layoffs, and ecological harm. As a small group just starting out, we can care deeply, but often don't know how to turn that passion into real impact. So they're asking if we could please suggest some ways young people and grassroots organizations can responsibly raise awareness for this or engage in advocacy where they're still learning to stay legally credible. And just before we pop that to you all, I do want to say that there is maybe a little glimmer of hope on April 10th. At least the FDA announced it will be phasing out current requirements for animal testing and the development of monoclonal antibody. I'll leave that to the scientists, antibody therapies and other drugs, replacing them with more effective human relevant methods. So that's one nice little glimmer of hope. But to answer the question, would anyone like to jump in there?
First off, I'll say scientifically, we all wanted to get away from animal testing. It's not relevant. It's not needed. It's not scientifically germane, and it hasn't been for like 30 years. So this is great. I hope it continues. I'll just say to those of you that are listening right now, I don't know if my old ass can tell you a better way to do something than you can. You're the cool young kids doing the thing. So your creativity is what's going to solve this in part. So you probably already know the better way to do this but I will say the most important thing that the goal is to get yourself heard and get yourself disproportionately in front of the right people. And that means I think the best thing you can do as someone who did not know how to do government advocacy and all that stuff is to shamelessly just talk to the decision maker. Like getting in front of the right person without trying to go through 17 layers is actually an underused pathway. And so effectively spamming the chat with the person you want to talk to. That would be my thing. But ultimately, like we need you to figure it out. Like, yes, we'll offer things here, but like you're the generation that's going to inherit the earth. So we're hoping you also have cool new solutions too.
Yeah, flood the zone with your own stuff. I like it. Like they're doing that. We need to do that too. Leveraging alternative media and direct communication channels, like for sure. And we need to build these coalitions to amplify these messages, partnerships between veterinarians and doctors and food safety advocates and environmental groups can create a louder, more credible voice for sure. And we need to stay factual and refuse to just mirror those industry talking points. It's really tempting to just kind of debunk the industry narratives point by point, but in doing that, we can sort of reinforce them too. So I think, we've had really good luck talking directly to the media and journalists to get our message out there. But I also agree we need to do more to talk directly to policymakers and really amplify how we need to drastically change systems in order to protect our public health and our food safety and animal welfare too.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that, if trying to figure out what, I would look at some of particularly if you're looking at the environmental impacts, there's a lot of people already doing a lot of the work. So I would say you don't have to create the solutions all on your own. I think, as Dr. Schultz said, you all are probably good at communicating, but make sure, look at what other people, look at what the environmental organizations, look at if you want to look at some things about how you possibly can raise animals in a more humane way, you can look at my organization. So I would say, as young people, look at other sources that have been working on this for a long time, and then think about it. How does that tie into your own story? What does this mean to you? And then talk from your own perspective, but based on what you've learned from other people that have been spending a lot of time working on this.
I think I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question. It dovetails from Chris Ku's question. What are lobbying efforts like on all these issues? And what's the tone that we should be taking? Hostile, friendly? Is it a waste of time? And then my own question is, where's the best money best spent in lobbying for or against the issues we've discussed? And we've got 1 minute, guys.
I'll be brief. Your actual representative is always a great place to start. State, local, and federal, all of those. And then also, I only run nonpartisan, bipartisan lobbying shops. I don't believe that you get anywhere adversarially. I do think you have to bring a solution that's going to work for all Americans and a global community.
Well said. thank you so much to all of our panelists, Dr. Heath, Steve, and Eric, and everyone who joined us here today.